We have Dr. Van Davender.
Good afternoon. Want to thank you for your attention this afternoon. What I'm going to be talking about are the options for closing manure storage and treatment systems. Really what I'm going to do is expound upon one of the slides that Terry just presented. And my goal in my presentation is to help the audience understand kind of an overview of what the options are for closure, so that when they're working with the producers and the landowners, they will be able to help them understand the options. And really it boils down to a decision on the part of the landowner or the manager in terms of what's going to take place with that particular facility. And of course, a decision of this nature, you're going to have to consider the future plans for the farm, what the fate for the storage unit and the permit are going to be, and those two are not necessarily the same thing. I'll provide a little more details on that in a minute. Of course, there always is the requirements for your legal and permits that have to be addressed, and in all decisions, there's a financial component that needs to be considered. Before we get into looking at the options, there are some storage concepts that I think we need to consider. The first is accumulated manure solids are usually considered a liability in the long term. There may be a short-term benefit in terms of there's a source of nutrients for a crop, but the long-term accumulated manures are usually considered a liability. And in the cleaning process or the closure process, the first step is going to be clean the barns, clean the areas that normally provide manure to be delivered to the storage. Clean those areas first, then clean the storage unit. The other component that we need to remember is that if a facility is going to be transferring ownership or maybe receiving animals from a different integrator, barn and storage cleaning is likely to be required due to biosecurity and health considerations for the animals. All of the manure that is removed from the storage unit will need to be land applied. The application rates for the manure when it is land applied is the application should not exceed the crop nitrogen needs after the nitrogen losses are considered. And in most cases, there'll be a concern about the phosphorus, so the rates may actually be lower than what the crop nitrogen needs are. So both the nitrogen and phosphorus application rates are normally considered. And if land is limited, the land receiving the manure is limited, it may actually take more than one cropping season to completely remove and utilize the manure nutrients that are in the unit. There are some additional critical concepts that we need to think about when we're talking about closing a storage unit. The first is typically the engineers and the consultants are focusing their attention on the physical structure itself. What happens physically with that structure? The regulatory agencies are concerned with the physical component of that structure, obviously, but they're also concerned with the permit. And those two are interrelated, but not necessarily, there are some differences that we'll need to remember. Usually, to close a permit, you're going to have to close the structure first. However, as indicated a little earlier, sometimes you can close or renovate the structure and still maintain the permit if that fits the business model for the operation. There are three basic approaches to closing storages and the permits. The first is you keep your manure storage and you keep your permit. Essentially what you're doing is you're operating that facility like you always have, except you're no longer generating manure going into the facility. Now, what we do need to remember is the scope of this presentation is national, so there will be potential differences between states. Some states don't mandate that a closure take place within a period of time. Other states say within a number of years you have to close. After the animals leave the farm, you will need to close the storage. So you'll need to pay attention to the state regulations. The second option is to renovate your storage and keep your permit. And essentially what you're doing with renovation is you're bringing it back to as-built or as-designed storage capacities. And the third option is to close your storage facility and close the permit. The primary concept we need to remember is it's not feasible, it's not possible to leave the manure in the storage unit and close the permit in most cases. Looking at some of the details for the first option of manure storage and manage the manure and keeping the permit, as I indicated earlier, what you're doing is you're following the normal management practices, maintaining your freeboards, maintaining your record keeping with your land applications, maintaining all of the permit requirements. The only difference is you're no longer generating manure to go into that storage unit. This approach minimizes your initial cost because essentially they're just your ongoing costs as they have been. You will have ongoing management costs in terms of your manure water management and your application cost management. You're not going to be able to close the permit without doing additional work to close the facility, which means you're going to need to keep your permit active. And if the facility will be used for livestock production in the future, this has the potential of increasing or at least maintaining the property value because now you have an active permit that at times has a marketable value. However, accumulated manure storage will likely decrease the property value in the future because if you're coming in with a new set of animals and you've got biosecurity concerns, you're just delaying the cost of total solids removal, total cleanup. The next option is to renovate your storage and to keep your permit. Essentially, in this approach, you're going through the same process. You're cleaning your barns, you're land applying all the manure, you're cleaning and the storage unit to its original as-built capacity. Your costs for this approach are usually a little bit higher than they are for the first option we discussed. You will still have some ongoing management costs because you will still need to maintain the water levels of your facility, and you'll still have the permitting cost of any permit fees and record-keeping fees associated with it. And again, if you have not closed that facility, you'll need to keep that permit active. But this approach has the advantage that you have removed the manure accumulation and you've potentially maximized the property value if the property will be used for livestock production in the future. The last option we're going to be talking about is closing the storage and closing the permit. With this particular option, there are two basic approaches. The first is conversion of this storage unit to a freshwater pond or reservoir. The second option is making sure that this storage unit is modified in such a way that it will not retain water and that the soil grades are returned to stable grades. And in both cases, the process is going to be cleaning the barns, land applying the manure, prevent future manure loading to the storage unit or area. Typically that's going to mean pulling out plumbing or removing gutters or drains. With conversion to fresh water, quite often what will need to happen is some dirt work to ensure that you have surface drainage that goes into the reservoir so it actually catches surface runoff. And quite often there'll be a requirement for a designed spillway to be installed. With returning to a stable soil grade, it's going to be run the gamut from coming up with enough fill to completely fill a hole to maybe removing embankments to the point that you ensure drainage off of the site so that there is no opportunity for standing water to take place. After the dirt work is done, for both cases, there's usually a need for going back and revegetating your disturbed area to control and prevent erosion. At this point, the storage unit has been removed, and in most cases, the closing the permit will be required. However, at this time, you're usually free of any permit requirements. This approach is typically the highest of your initial investment costs. However, since you've closed the facility and you've closed the permit, there are usually no or very limited ongoing costs associated with this approach. In addition, if you're looking at using your property and land for alternative uses than livestock production, This increases the alternative land use options and may increase its property value. Kind of summarizing this whole concept and process is you've got a decision tree that you kind of have to work through on this process. Is once an individual finds himself in a position of no longer having any animals on the farm, the first decision that needs to be made is, do I want to keep the permit or do I want to close the permit? If the decision is to keep the permit, the second decision is, do I want to continue with my normal manure management practices and minimize those upfront costs? Or do I want to renovate this facility, bring it back to its original as-built conditions and storage capacity, and then keep the permit active? If the decision is made to close the permit, the next decision that needs to be made is, do I want to convert to a freshwater system, or do I want to return to a stable soil grade? I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I'll be available at the end of this presentation for any comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Well, so far we've heard about